Welcome to the next in our series of online lectures for U.S. History 1. Today's lecture is titled The Challenge of New France, and it poses a pretty important question, and that is, who will dominate North America? Will it be the English or will it be the French? As always, there are some key terms that you should keep track of as you are watching this lecture. Actually, there's quite a few terms, I'm sorry, but there's a lot of important stuff in this week's lecture. And also some important questions you should be able to answer by the time we get to the end of this lecture. So anyway, that said, let's get to it. By the middle of the 1700s, England had 13 colonies on the mainland of North America. The colonies, while dominated by the English, were racially and ethnically diverse. There were Dutch in New York and in New Jersey, Scots in Pennsylvania and throughout the South, Germans in Pennsylvania, and of course African slaves spread throughout all 13 colonies. Moreover, by the 1700s, the colonies not only survived, they were beginning to grow. By 1750, there were roughly 1.2 million people living in England's 13 colonies. Moreover, most of these people were young families. This ensured that the 13 colonies would continue to grow into the next few generations. These colonies were economically diverse. The middle colonies of Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey featured small farmers who focused primarily on growing food. The southern colonies, with their focus on rice and tobacco production, primarily depended upon large plantations worked by African slaves. New England, which had very poor soil and a very short growing season, focused on trade and commerce to make its money. This diversity gave the 13 colonies stability that had been lacking in the early years of Jamestown and Plymouth. But the English were only one of many European nations attempting to establish colonies in the Americas. We have already discussed the Spanish, who focused their energies on Mexico and South America. The French, in contrast, built their empire in what is now eastern Canada and the Midwestern United States. By 1750, the Spanish were in decline, however, so therefore we will focus our attention on the French in New France. In contrast to the Spanish, New France was growing in power by 1750. In fact, it would become a true challenger to the English and their 13 colonies. The first permanent French settlement in North America was Quebec, which was established by the explorer Samuel de Champlain in 1608, just a year after Jamestown was founded in 1607. Champlain picked this site along the St. Lawrence River for a reason. The St. Lawrence provided easy access to the sea, which lay to the east, and to the North American tribes that lay to the north, south, and west. These tribes were critical to the livelihood of Quebec and of all of New France. New France presents us with another colonial model that was very different from that studied thus far. Whereas England's American colonies, after a few decades of struggle, began to grow and thrive, the population of New France grew very, very slowly. By 1666, for example, the population of New France stood at just over 3,000 residents. By 1720, that population had risen to more than 24,500 people. Now, while that growth demonstrated the colony's stability, it paled in comparison to that of the English. By 1700, the population of the 13 English colonies had surpassed 250,000 people. The economics of New France also differed greatly from that of England's colonies. While England's colonies had varied economies, that in New France depended largely on one industry, the fur trade. Early French explorers discovered the area's rivers and streams teeming with fur-bearing animals such as otter, mink, and especially the beaver. The pelts from these animals were highly valued in Europe. Thus, while the English settlers at Jamestown sought to get rich by growing tobacco, those of New France focused on the fur trade. In fact, the fur trade is going to affect everything about New France. That includes the relations between the colonists and native populations. The French realized early on that if they were going to get rich off of furs, they were going to need the help of Indian tribes. That's because Indians controlled the rivers and streams where the beaver and otter lived. They could stop any European nation seeking to push inland. Thus, as the French fur traders moved inland, they developed true partnerships with the people they encountered. Most of these people were eastern woodland peoples, much like the Wampanoags who we met in our discussion of New England. In other words, they were semi-sedentary. That means they practiced limited agriculture, but also relied on hunting and gathering for their survival. These tribes quickly learned that a partnership with the French was valuable to them. In exchange for the fur pelts, the French would give the Indians guns and iron pots, iron knives, and other goods that they valued. Thus, the fur trade created what one historian calls a middle ground. This means that neither the Indians nor the French dominated the trade. Both sides needed the other, and so they cooperated. Thus, the French relationship with the Indians was quite different from that of the English. The English, remember, wanted land for farming. Indians had that land, and that created conflict. The French, on the other hand, needed the Indians if the fur trade was going to succeed. They could not afford to antagonize tribes by driving them off of their lands or disrupting their hunting grounds. There was one exception to France's good relations with the native tribes, however. That exception was the Iroquois. The Iroquois were actually a confederation of 5 independent tribes. That confederation included the Mohawk, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Oneida, and the Seneca. They were based in what is today New York. The Iroquois were the largest and most powerful native tribe in the Northeast. In fact, one New Englander wrote in 1674, quote, "In truth, they were in time of war so great a terror to all the Indians that the appearance of 4 or 5 Mohawks in the woods would frighten them from their habitations." End quote. The cause behind France's conflict with the Iroquois related to the fur trade. Access to European goods such as knives, guns, and iron pots was very valuable, and the Iroquois wanted to control it. They were angry with the French for seeking to trade with tribes like the Huron and the Ottawa, who they saw as their enemy. Thus, they tried to destroy these tribes in order to guarantee control of the fur trade and the valuable European goods that accompanied that trade. These wars were very, very bloody at times. The Iroquois, in fact, nearly wiped out the Huron as an independent people. They even threatened the colony of Quebec at various times. Ultimately, however, the French and their allies prevailed. Another thing that made the French colonial model different was religion. While the English were predominantly Protestant, the French were Catholic. The Catholic influence of the French was spread by Catholic missionaries, especially the Jesuits. Like the English and the Spanish, the French also sought to convert native peoples to Christianity. Now, unlike other European Christians, however, the French Jesuits did not simply build churches and expect Indians to convert. Instead, they went to live among the native peoples. These Jesuit missionaries traveled far inland and learned the languages of the native peoples. They ate their food and they followed their customs. These efforts paid off. The Jesuits converted thousands of native peoples to the Catholic faith. They also helped France to maintain close relations with the native peoples and even helped to map and explore much of the interior of the continent. Thus, in this way, the Jesuits were another example of the middle ground. By 1700, the French laid claim to 1/4 of the North American continent. These claims extended from Newfoundland in the far northeast to New Orleans at the mouth of the Mississippi River. French fur traders and Jesuits had traveled up the Missouri River and its tributaries and helped to explore even the Red River system in what is now North Dakota and Minnesota. But despite the extent of these land claims, France's control of North America was rather tenuous. Remember, New France was very sparsely populated. By 1720, there were only 24,594 French men and women living in this huge territory. This made the entire colony about the same size as the city of Philadelphia. Now, for the most part, the French and English empires grew independently of one another throughout most of the 1600s. That began to change in the 1700s when the English pushed beyond the Appalachian Mountains into lands claimed by the French. They did this partially to open up new lands for farming. With the growing population of the 13 colonies, there was increasing need for land. Another reason, however, was the fur trade. The English, too, wanted a piece of this very lucrative fur trade, and they found the Iroquois to be willing partners. In this way, the initial conflict between the Iroquois and the French ultimately will turn into a conflict between the English and the French. This is reflected in the comment of one French fur trader, who remarked, quote, "The Mohawks hear that there is a war betwixt France and England, and as they are one hand and soul with the English, they will take up the axe with pleasure against the French." End quote. To be honest, there was not simply one war between the French and the English. Instead, the two sparred with one another in a series of conflicts that in England were typically named after whoever was sitting on the English throne at the time. The colonists in America were intimately involved in these conflicts. Colonial soldiers volunteered to fight the French and their Indian allies. Now, the colonists often got caught in the middle of these conflicts as well. Settlers living on the frontier of the 13 colonies were particularly vulnerable to French and Indian attack. Here is an account of one such attack. It is quoted by the historian John Demos in his book, The Unredeemed Captive. Quote, "Roused out of their sleep by their violent endeavors to break open doors and windows with axes and hatchets, William leaps from bed, runs to the front door, and sees the enemy making their entrance. The enemy immediately breaks into the room. I judged the number of 20 with painted faces and hideous acclamations. Some were so cruel and barbarous as to take and carry to the door 2 of my children, and murder them, as also a black woman, a family slave named Parthena." End quote. As brutal as these early conflicts were, these wars were merely a warm-up for the big one. Now, this conflict is known by many names. Some historians call it the 7 Years' War. Others call it the French and Indian War. Historians today, however, now seem to prefer the name the Great War for Empire because it shows what was at stake. And what was at stake? Well, merely the question of which European power was going to dominate the North American continent. This is one of the most fundamental questions in the entire history of the United States. Fittingly, the war began in America over a fundamental question: who will control the Ohio River Valley? The Ohio River Valley consisted of rich lands for farming and lucrative rivers and streams for the fur trade. American colonists, including one you might have heard of, future U.S. President George Washington, wanted to control that land in order to get rich. The French, however, argued that the territory was part of their empire. In 1754, a very young George Washington led a small military force into the Ohio River country. He built a small fort named Fort Necessity in what is now Pennsylvania to establish his claim to the land. The French attacked and drove Washington back to Virginia. No one knew it at the time, but the Great War for Empire had just begun. As I said earlier, one popular name for this conflict was the French and Indian War. That shows the important role that Native Americans played in the conflict. In fact, tribes actually fought on both sides. While the Iroquois allied themselves with the English, the French were supported by most of the other tribes. Now, this makes sense if you were a Native American. Other than the Iroquois, the native tribes knew that a French victory was in their best interest.